The steam rising from Percival Langston's cast-iron pot carried secrets no soul in Timber Creek should have swallowed. In the autumn of 1895, when the Idaho Territory still tasted of gold dust and broken dreams, two brothers served the finest chili west of the Continental Divide, and nobody ever asked why travelers who stopped at their roadhouse never seemed to continue their journeys. This is the story of how an entire community chose flavor over truth, and how hunger can make people blind to the most terrible ingredients. The wind through Timber Creek carried three things that October morning: the bite of early frost, the metallic tang of mining equipment, and the rich, smoky aroma drifting from the Langston Brothers roadhouse. Percival Langston stirred his pot with the same wooden spoon he'd used for 7 years, while his younger brother, Lucius Thompson, they'd taken different surnames after a family dispute back in Ohio, chopped onions with methodical precision. The roadhouse sat where the mining trail split toward Silver Falls, a weathered 2-story building with a crooked chimney and windows that never seemed to catch the light quite right. Travelers called it a godsend. After days of hardtack and bitter coffee, the Langston Brothers chili tasted like salvation in a bowl. Thick, hearty, with a depth of flavor that lingered long after the last spoonful, men would ride 20 extra miles just to taste it again. The secret, Percival always claimed with a crooked smile, was in the meat blend, a special recipe passed down from their grandmother. The recipe was special, all right, just not in the way anyone imagined. Cornelia Thompson, the local schoolteacher and Lucius's distant cousin, first noticed the pattern in late September. She kept meticulous records of everything: her students' attendance, the weather, even the comings and goings at the roadhouse across from the schoolyard. In her leather-bound journal, she'd begun marking the travelers who stopped for meals, a notation system that started as idle curiosity but grew into something darker as the weeks passed. September 21st. Prospector with pack mule arrives at roadhouse. 11:15 a.m., she wrote in her careful script. September 22nd. Mule found wandering near creek. No sign of owner. The mule incident wasn't isolated. Irving Wheeler, the town's unofficial chronicler and keeper of tall tales, loved to hold court at Malachi Everhart's general store. Strangest thing, he'd say, stroking his gray beard. Fellow named Hamilton Cyrus Hamilton came through last week. Talked my ear off about his claims up north. Said he'd be back through in 3 days with supplies. Wheeler would pause for effect, letting the silence stretch. That was 10 days ago. His horse showed up yesterday, saddle still on, reins cut clean. The townspeople of Timber Creek had grown comfortable with mysteries. In a territory where men disappeared into mine shafts, got lost in blizzards, or simply decided to start fresh somewhere else, a few missing travelers hardly raised eyebrows. But Cornelia Thompson's mathematical mind saw patterns where others saw coincidence. The quality of the chili seemed to improve with each disappearance. Henrietta Reed ran the boarding house 2 streets over, and she'd started keeping her own informal tally. Not of missing people, she wasn't the suspicious type, but of compliments. "Best chili I've ever tasted" became the most common phrase she heard from guests who'd eaten at the roadhouse. The frequency of such praise had tripled since midsummer. "It's like they've discovered some new cut of meat," she mentioned to Viola Eastwood during their Tuesday sewing circle. Rich, tender, with a flavor you can't quite place. Viola, whose late husband had been a butcher, nodded thoughtfully. Percival claimed he gets his meat from a supplier in Boise. Special arrangement, but I've never seen a delivery wagon. The sewing circle fell quiet. In a town where every wagon, every rider, every bit of commerce was noticed and discussed, the absence of a meat delivery was like a missing note in a familiar song. Something was wrong with the melody. But hunger has a way of silencing questions, especially when the alternative is another night of beans and hardtack. The Langston Brothers chili had become more than sustenance. It was comfort, community, a reason to gather. Sunday dinners at the roadhouse drew families from 3 neighboring settlements. How do you question paradise when your stomach is full and your neighbors are smiling? Eudora Blackwell, the town's midwife and closest thing to a doctor, possessed the keen observational skills her profession demanded. She'd begun to notice changes in the brothers themselves. Percival had always been thin, almost gaunt, but lately he'd filled out. His color was better. Lucius, once pale and sickly-looking, now had the robust appearance of a man who ate well. Very well indeed. October 3rd, Cornelia wrote in her journal, Jebediah Stewart, traveling tinker, arrives with wagon full of pots and pans. Wagon found empty 2 miles south of town, October 5th. Brothers serve largest pot of chili yet recorded. The mathematical correlation was becoming impossible to ignore. But what could one schoolteacher do against an entire community's willful blindness, especially when the alternative to the Langston Brothers' hospitality was admitting they'd all been tasting something that shouldn't exist? Every spoonful contained a choice, comfort or truth. And truth, as Cornelia was beginning to understand, often came at a price no one wanted to pay. The first snow was still weeks away, but the wind already carried winter's promise through Timber Creek. Inside the roadhouse, Percival Langston ladled another serving of his special recipe, and somewhere in the kitchen, Lucius sharpened his knives for the next unsuspecting traveler who would mistake their hospitality for salvation. But what Cornelia Thompson didn't know, what none of them knew, was that someone had been watching the watchers, and they were about to discover that some secrets refused to stay buried. Louisa Oakley crouched behind the woodshed at precisely 11:47 p.m., her breath forming small clouds in the October air as she watched Lucius Thompson drag something heavy across the roadhouse's backyard. The thing left a dark trail in the frost-covered grass, and the metallic scraping sound made her teeth ache. What she witnessed that night would either save Timber Creek or destroy her sanity, because some knowledge burns through a person like acid through cloth. The creak of the general store's floorboards, the musty scent of burlap sacks, and the rough texture of wool blankets surrounded Louisa as she'd worked late into the evening, taking inventory for Malachi Everhart. As his assistant bookkeeper, she often stayed after hours, reconciling accounts by lamplight. But tonight, movement across the street had caught her attention through the store's front window. The Langston Brothers' roadhouse stood dark, except for a single light flickering in the kitchen window. Most decent folk were long asleep, but Percival and Lucius seemed to keep their own schedule. Louisa had noticed this before late-night activity, strange sounds, the occasional glimpse of figures moving in the shadows behind the building. Her curiosity had finally overcome her caution. Slipping out the store's back door, she'd positioned herself where she could observe without being seen. The woodshed provided perfect cover, its weathered boards blocking her from view while offering gaps wide enough to peer through. What she saw defied every reasonable explanation. Lucius emerged from what appeared to be a root cellar she'd never noticed before, its entrance hidden behind stacked firewood. He carried a bundle wrapped in canvas, roughly the size and shape of a person, but clearly too heavy for one man to manage easily. The way he struggled with it, the careful manner in which he avoided letting it bump against the ground, suggested contents more fragile than firewood or grain. The bundle had the unmistakable dimensions of human remains. Percival appeared moments later, carrying a wooden crate and several mason jars that clinked softly as he walked. Even in the dim moonlight, Louisa could see dark stains on his apron stains that looked suspiciously like dried blood. The brothers worked with the efficiency of long practice, moving their cargo toward a second building she'd never paid attention to before. A small smokehouse tucked behind the main structure. "Load's getting heavy," Percival's voice carried clearly in the still air. "Might need to make another batch tomorrow." "That traveling preacher should provide good stock," Lucius replied. "Been eating well by the look of him." Their words hit Louisa like physical blows. Stock. Batch. The casual tone, as if they were discussing livestock rather than human beings. Her hands trembled as she pressed closer to the woodshed wall, splinters digging into her palms. The traveling preacher. She remembered him, Jebediah Stewart, the kind-faced man who delivered Sunday service just 3 days ago. He'd planned to continue north toward Coeur d'Alene, but his wagon had been found abandoned near the creek yesterday morning. Nobody had questioned his disappearance. Nobody except the woman now watching his probable fate unfold in the shadows behind the roadhouse. The brothers disappeared into the smokehouse, and for several minutes, only muffled sounds emerged. The thud of heavy objects being moved, the scrape of metal against wood. Once, what might have been the sound of a saw working through bone. Death had a recipe here. When they emerged, both men carried themselves differently satisfied, accomplished, like craftsmen completing a familiar task. Percival wiped his hands on a fresh towel, while Lucius secured the smokehouse door with not one, but 3 separate padlocks. "Should be ready by Thursday," Percival said. "Maybe sooner if this cold snap holds." "Good timing," Lucius replied. "Viola Eastwood mentioned wanting extra portions for her church social. Said folks can't get enough of our special blend." The church social. Louisa's stomach lurched as she realized the implications. Half the town would be there, including children, families gathering to share a meal that contained ingredients no human being should ever consume. She'd stumbled onto something far worse than murder. She'd discovered a feeding ground. The brothers completed their midnight routine and disappeared back into the roadhouse. Louisa remained hidden for another 30 minutes, partly from caution and partly because her legs refused to support her weight. When she finally crept back to the general store, her mind raced with impossible choices. Who could she tell? Sheriff Malachi Everhart was Lucius's employer and friend. The town doctor, Irving Wheeler, was a regular customer at the roadhouse. Even Cornelia Thompson, for all her record-keeping and suspicions, was Lucius's cousin. Everyone in Timber Creek was either complicit, compromised, or completely unaware of what they'd been consuming for months. Louisa spent the remainder of the night sitting in Malachi's office chair, staring at the ledger books without seeing them. By dawn, she'd made her decision. She couldn't expose the truth directly, not yet. But she could gather evidence, document everything, and find someone outside Timber Creek who might listen. The problem was time. According to what she'd overheard, the brothers were already preparing their next victim. The traveling preacher would soon become Thursday's special, served hot and fragrant to an unsuspecting community that had grown addicted to flavors they couldn't identify. But Louisa Oakley hadn't seen the worst of it yet. Hidden in the smokehouse, behind those 3 padlocks, lay evidence that would reveal the true scope of the Langston Brothers' operation. Evidence that would prove this wasn't just about survival or even madness. It was about perfection, the art of turning human suffering into culinary pleasure, refined over months of practice into a process so efficient, so carefully calibrated, that even the screams had been silenced. And tomorrow night, Louisa would discover exactly how they'd learned to work so quietly. The screaming had stopped weeks ago, replaced by a method so refined that victims never realized their final meal was also their last. Inside the hidden cellar beneath the Langston Brothers' roadhouse, Percival had perfected what he called the gentle approach, a technique that transformed murder into something resembling mercy. This wasn't random violence born of desperation, but a carefully developed craft that treated human beings like livestock bred for flavor. The damp earth walls of the cellar bore the scent of iron and limestone, while rough wooden shelving held an array of glass bottles filled with colorless liquids. The texture of the dirt floor had been packed smooth from months of use, worn into paths that led from the entrance to a series of wooden tables arranged with surgical precision. Percival descended the steep stairs at exactly 6 a.m., carrying his morning tea and a leather-bound notebook filled with observations that read like a butcher's guide to human anatomy. Subject exhibits optimal marbling. He'd written about Cyrus Hamilton, the prospector who'd disappeared 3 weeks earlier. Extended stress produces inferior taste. Recommend immediate processing for future specimens. The brothers had learned through trial and error that fear soured the meat. Their early victims, desperate men who'd fought and screamed and begged, had yielded tough, bitter results that barely improved their standard fare. But Percival possessed the methodical mind of a natural scientist, and he'd approached the problem like any other culinary challenge, through experimentation and careful documentation. The breakthrough had come in July, when a traveling salesman named Eudora Blackwell's cousin had stopped for the night. Instead of the usual basement struggle, Percival had offered him a special digestif after dinner, a smooth, honey-flavored liqueur that masked the taste of concentrated laudanum. The man had simply drifted off to sleep at the table, peaceful and content, never knowing he wouldn't wake up. The difference in meat quality had been remarkable. Stress hormones affect muscle fiber density, Percival explained to Lucius as they worked side by side in the cellar that morning. A relaxed specimen provides superior tenderness and flavor complexity. Lucius nodded, focused on his own task, organizing the glass bottles according to a system only he understood. Each contained a different mixture, some for inducing sleep, others for relaxing muscles, a few designed to enhance the final taste through what he called biological preparation. The new batch should be ready for processing, Lucius said, consulting his own notebook. 3 days of the special diet, plus the herbal supplements, should yield approximately 15 pounds of usable product. 15 pounds. Enough to supply the roadhouse for nearly a week, with extra portions for the church social that everyone anticipated so eagerly. The special diet was Lucius's innovation. Instead of immediate processing, they'd learned to keep victims alive for several days, feeding them specific foods designed to improve flavor and texture. Corn to add sweetness, fresh milk for tenderness, special herbs that affected the taste of muscle tissue in ways that would have fascinated any serious chef, if those chefs could have stomached the source. Above them, the roadhouse operated normally, early morning travelers stopping for coffee and biscuits, completely unaware that their hosts were discussing the finer points of human husbandry just 20 feet below their boots. The sound of footsteps on the floorboards provided a rhythm to the brothers' work, busy, normal, reassuringly domestic. Mrs. Eastwood wants extra portions again, Percival noted, reviewing yesterday's orders. Claims her church ladies can't stop talking about our recipe. Supply might become an issue, Lucius replied. Traffic's been light lately. Might need to expand our hunting range. Hunting range. As if travelers were wild game to be harvested rather than human beings with families and futures. The casual brutality of their language revealed how completely they'd divorced themselves from normal human sentiment. But their system had one weakness they hadn't yet recognized. It required isolation to function. The roadhouse's remote location had allowed them to perfect their methods undisturbed, but it also meant they'd grown careless about observation. They had no idea that Louisa Oakley had spent the last 2 nights mapping their routine from her hiding spot behind the woodshed. They didn't know she'd already identified the cellar entrance, timed their movements, and begun documenting their operation with the same methodical precision they applied to their victims. Most importantly, they didn't know she'd discovered the feeding schedule. Every 3 days, like clockwork, one of them would descend to the cellar carrying a tray of special food, always at dawn, always alone, always returning within 30 minutes, which meant their current victim was still alive, still being prepared for processing, still potentially savable. But rescue would require more than courage. It would require someone willing to descend into that cellar and face whatever horrors the Langston brothers had refined into an art form. The gentle approach had one fundamental flaw. It assumed victims would remain unconscious throughout the entire process. But what if someone had built up a tolerance to laudanum? What if they'd only pretended to succumb to the drugged liqueur? What if, even now, someone lay in that cellar, listening to every word, waiting for the perfect moment to escape and expose the truth about Timber Creek's favorite meal? Percival was about to discover that his perfect system had created the perfect witness. Henrietta Reed had been conscious for 73 hours, her body paralyzed by carefully measured doses of curare, while her mind remained trapped in absolute clarity behind unblinking eyes. Every whispered conversation, every clinical discussion of her preparation, every detail of her eventual fate, she'd heard it all, while the Langston brothers assumed she was nothing more than unconscious meat awaiting processing. Now, she knew exactly how many people had disappeared before her and exactly how little time she had left to somehow signal for help. The musty dampness of packed earth surrounded her prone form, while the acrid taste of chemical restraints coated her tongue, and the rough wool blanket beneath her body provided the only barrier between her skin and the cellar's cold floor. Through her motionless eyelids, she could detect the faint amber glow of an oil lamp that burned continuously in the corner. Her captors' consideration for their livestock's comfort during the preparation phase. Henrietta had been traveling from Boise to visit her sister in Coeur d'Alene when she'd stopped at the roadhouse on October 10th. A widow of 43 with sharp business instincts, she'd immediately noticed the unusual quality of the establishment. Too clean, too well organized, with an efficiency that suggested experience beyond normal hospitality. The dinner had been exceptional tender beef in a rich sauce that lingered on the palate. The digestive afterward, a honey-colored liqueur that Percival had claimed was a family recipe, had tasted slightly medicinal but pleasantly warm. She'd complimented both brothers on their culinary skills just moments before the world began to blur around the edges. But Henrietta Reed had survived 2 difficult pregnancies, a mining accident that killed her husband, and 3 cases of pneumonia. Her constitution was stronger than the Langston brothers had calculated. The curare had paralyzed her body completely, but her consciousness had remained intact throughout what should have been her final sleep. For 3 days, she'd listened to their clinical discussions of her preparation, their casual planning of her eventual processing, their satisfaction with how well their system functioned. Muscle tone is excellent. Percival had noted during yesterday's examination, his hands moving over her motionless form like a rancher evaluating livestock. The dietary supplements have produced optimal results. Processing scheduled for tomorrow morning, Lucius had added, consulting his notebook. Church social is Sunday. Perfect timing. Perfect timing. As if her death was nothing more than a scheduling consideration for their culinary calendar. But the brothers had made one crucial error in their assessment. They'd assumed that a middle-aged boarding house operator would succumb to their standard dosage like every other victim. They hadn't accounted for her years of taking laudanum for chronic pain, a tolerance that had allowed her consciousness to persist despite their chemical restraints. She'd heard everything, the detailed discussions of previous victims, the refinements to their technique, the casual mention of how Cyrus Hamilton had provided excellent shoulder cuts, while Jebediah Stewart's tenderloin had been particularly well received at the recent church gathering. 27 people, by her count. 27 human beings processed through this cellar and served to an unsuspecting community that had developed an addiction to flavors they couldn't identify. Through her paralyzed form, she'd also detected something else. Footsteps above that didn't belong to either brother, lighter, more careful, moving with the deliberate caution of someone trying not to be heard. The same pattern had occurred for the last 2 nights, always around midnight, always ending abruptly when the brothers completed their evening routine. Someone was watching them. Someone had noticed the pattern. If she could somehow signal that observer, perhaps coordinate an escape attempt during the narrow window when only one brother tended the cellar. But communication required movement, and movement remained impossible under the influence of their paralytic cocktail. Her only hope lay in the gradual metabolization of the chemicals, a process that typically took 4 to 6 hours longer than the brothers realized. Time was measured differently when death had a schedule. Percival's footsteps descended the cellar stairs at precisely 6:15 a.m., carrying the morning feeding tray and his leather observation journal. Today's meal would be her last, specially designed to enhance flavor while ensuring she remained unconscious during the final processing. "Good morning, my dear," he said pleasantly, as if addressing a guest rather than a victim. "Today's preparation includes fresh herbs from our garden. I think you'll find the taste quite remarkable." But as he lifted the spoon toward her motionless lips, Henrietta felt the first faint tingle in her fingertips, sensation returning as the curare gradually lost its hold on her nervous system. The paralysis was breaking down. Her recovery was beginning 12 hours ahead of schedule, and tonight, when that mysterious observer returned to their midnight vigil, they might witness something the Langston brothers had never experienced, a victim who could fight back. The question was whether Henrietta could maintain her paralyzed facade long enough to turn the hunters into the hunted, or whether her slight return of movement would betray her awareness before she could strike. Henrietta Reed's index finger twitched at 11:32 p.m., the first voluntary movement she'd managed in 4 days, while 20 feet above her head, Louisa Oakley crept toward the cellar entrance with a crowbar stolen from Malachi Everhart's tool shed. 2 women, separated by wooden planks and darkness, were about to collide in a moment that would either save them both or doom them to become ingredients in tomorrow's special recipe. What neither realized was that their separate acts of rebellion were about to expose the most horrific truth Timber Creek had ever swallowed. The October wind carried the sharp bite of approaching winter, the earthy scent of decomposing leaves, and the rough whistle through bare branches as Louisa positioned herself beside the hidden cellar entrance. She'd spent 3 nights studying the brothers' routine, timing their movements, identifying the narrow window when only one would be present in the main building. Tonight, Percival had retired early with what appeared to be a severe headache, leaving Lucius alone to tend the late evening tasks. But Louisa didn't know about the scheduling change. She didn't know that tonight was processing night. Inside the cellar, Henrietta felt sensations slowly returning to her extremities like water trickling back into a dried riverbed. The curare's grip had weakened enough for her to flex her fingers and shift her weight slightly, though her legs remained largely unresponsive. More importantly, her throat had regained enough function to produce sound. Not much, but perhaps enough to alert anyone who might be listening. The oil lamp cast dancing shadows on the earthen walls, illuminating shelves lined with mason jars, filled with preserved organs and labeled cuts of previous victims. Hamilton, shoulder, July 15th. Reed 1, Stewart, tenderloin, October 8th, declared another, a grotesque pantry of human remains organized with the same care most people reserved for preserving summer vegetables. Henrietta had memorized every jar, every label, every piece of evidence that would damn the Langston brothers if she could somehow survive to testify. Above her, footsteps moved across the kitchen floor with purposeful intent, not the casual movement of evening cleanup, but the decisive stride of someone beginning a familiar task. Metal implements clinked against wooden surfaces. A grinding wheel spun, sharpening blades to surgical precision. Processing night had arrived ahead of schedule. "Time to prepare our guest." Lucius's voice drifted down through the floorboards, accompanied by the sound of boots descending the cellar stairs. Henrietta forced her breathing to remain slow and shallow, fighting every instinct that screamed at her to flee. She had perhaps minutes before Lucius realized her paralysis had worn off, and in her current condition, she lacked the strength to overpower a healthy man armed with freshly sharpened knives. But she might have enough mobility to create a distraction. Lucius entered the cellar, carrying a leather roll filled with surgical instruments, his movements efficient and practiced. He'd performed this ritual dozens of times, always beginning with the same careful examination to ensure his subject remained properly unconscious. "Let's see how well you've prepared," he murmured, reaching for her wrist to check her pulse. That's when Henrietta struck. Her hand shot up with the desperate strength of someone facing immediate death, fingers clawing for his eyes. The movement caught Lucius completely off guard. Victims were supposed to be unconscious, compliant, already dead in everything but medical definition. Her fingernails raked across his cheek, drawing blood and a startled cry of pain. The sound carried through the floorboards and into the night air, where Louisa Oakley heard it clearly. A woman's voice, weak but unmistakably alive, followed by a man's angry shouting and the crash of overturned furniture. Someone was fighting for their life in that cellar, and they needed help immediately. Louisa abandoned stealth and attacked the cellar entrance with her crowbar, prying at the wooden cover with frantic desperation. The board splintered and gave way just as Lucius's bellowing brought Percival running from the main house. What in hell? Percival's voice cut through the night as he spotted Louisa's silhouette against the moonlight. She turned, crowbar raised, and saw both brothers advancing on her position. Behind Percival, lamplight spilled from the roadhouse's open door, illuminating his face in harsh yellow angles that revealed the true predator beneath his hospitable mask. "Miss Oakley," he said with deadly calm, "I'm afraid you've stumbled onto something that's none of your concern." "I've stumbled onto murder," she replied, backing toward the cellar entrance. 27 murders, if the jars down there tell the truth. Percival's expression didn't change, but his hand moved to the knife at his belt. 28, actually, though I suppose that makes you 29. From the cellar below came the sound of Henrietta Reed dragging herself toward the stairs, her legs still too weak to support her weight, but her voice growing stronger with each passing moment. "Help me," she called. "They're going to kill us all." But help was exactly what Percival and Lucius couldn't allow, not when their entire operation, their perfect system, their months of careful refinement hung in the balance. The brothers had faced this scenario before witnesses who discovered too much, but never two at once. Never with evidence already exposed and voices already raised in accusation. For the first time since beginning their grisly enterprise, the Langston brothers faced the possibility of being caught rather than doing the catching, and that terrified them far more than any of their victims had ever been terrified. Because predators, when cornered, don't just fight for survival, they fight to eliminate every witness who could expose what they've become. Section 6. Blood in the moonlight. Percival Langston's knife caught moonlight as it arced toward Louisa Oakley's throat, but her crowbar met the blade with a metallic shriek that shattered the October silence and sent sparks dancing across the frost-covered ground. Two weapons locked together while Henrietta Reed's desperate crawling echoed from the cellar below, creating a symphony of violence that would wake every soul in Timber Creek. This was the moment when careful planning collapsed into pure survival, and the hunters discovered that cornered prey fights with a ferocity that no amount of experience can prepare you for. The collision of iron against steel rang through the night air, accompanied by the sharp scent of struck metal and the rough scrape of boots fighting for purchase on slippery ground. Louisa twisted away from Percival's thrust, using the crowbar's length to maintain distance while backing toward the road that led to town. Her breath came in visible puffs, and her hands trembled, not from cold, but from the realization that she was fighting for more than her own life. She was fighting for every future victim who might stumble into this nightmare. "Lucius, secure the cellar," Percival commanded, without taking his eyes off Louisa. "We'll deal with our guest after we handle this complication." But Henrietta Reed had other plans. The boarding house owner had regained enough strength to reach the cellar stairs, and she used the wooden handrail to pull herself upright. Her legs wobbled like a newborn colt's, but desperation provided the stability that paralyzed muscles couldn't. "Fire!" she screamed toward the town, her voice carrying farther than it had any right to. Fire at the roadhouse. It was brilliant misdirection. Nothing brought people running faster than the threat of flames, especially in a timber town where one burning building could destroy everything. Within moments, lights began flickering on in distant windows, and the sound of hurried voices drifted across the valley. Percival's face twisted into something that belonged in one of his own jars. "You stupid woman. You have no idea what you've done." "I know exactly what I've done," Louisa replied, swinging the crowbar in a wide arc that forced both brothers back. "I've ended your dinner parties." Lucius emerged from the cellar, dragging Henrietta by her ankles, her weakened body bumping against each wooden step. But consciousness had returned enough strength for her to grab the doorframe and hold on, turning herself into dead weight that even a healthy man couldn't easily move. The sound of approaching voices grew louder. Lanterns bobbed in the distance as Timber Creek's volunteer fire brigade responded to Henrietta's alarm. Malachi Everhart's voice carried clearly as he organized the response, unaware that he was racing towards something far worse than any structural fire. "They're coming," Louisa said, backing further toward the road. "Every person in town will see what you've built here." "Not if there are no witnesses," Percival replied. But killing 2 women in full view of an approaching crowd presented logistical problems that even the Methodical brothers couldn't solve quickly. Their entire system depended on isolation, careful timing, and the appearance of normalcy. A public massacre would destroy everything they'd built. Percival made the calculation that would haunt him for the rest of his abbreviated life. "Burn it," he told Lucius. "All of it. The cellar, the smokehouse, everything. The evidence dies with them." Lucius nodded and sprinted toward the main building, presumably to gather oil and kindling. But Henrietta Reed had other plans. With her captor momentarily distracted, she managed to roll away from the cellar entrance and began crawling toward Louisa's position. "The jars," she gasped. 27 jars with names and dates. Don't let them burn the proof." Louisa looked between the approaching townspeople and the cellar entrance, calculating distances and time. She could save herself by running toward help, or risk everything by descending into that earthen chamber to preserve evidence that could convict the brothers. The decision took less than a heartbeat. She vaulted over Henrietta's prone form and disappeared into the cellar, crowbar in hand, racing against flames that hadn't even been lit yet. Behind her, Percival's roar of fury shook the night, but the approaching crowd prevented him from pursuing immediately. In the cellar, surrounded by the instruments of systematic murder, Louisa began smashing jars and collecting the labeled fragments, evidence that would either ensure justice or become her funeral pyre. Above ground, Henrietta Reed dragged herself toward the approaching lanterns, her voice growing stronger with each breath. "Murder," she called to the rescuers. "They're murderers. The chili is people." But would anyone believe such an impossible accusation? And could Louisa escape that cellar before Lucius returned with the matches that would erase every trace of the Langston brothers' terrible artistry? The answer would determine whether Timber Creek learned the truth about its favorite meal, or whether the secret died in flames that would light the October sky like a funeral pyre for the forgotten dead. Malachi Everhart's lantern illuminated 27 glass jars, arranged like trophies on wooden shelves, each bearing a name that someone in Timber Creek had once known. While behind him, the volunteer fire brigade stood frozen in horrified silence as the pieces of months of missing travelers finally assembled into one unspeakable picture. The smell of preserved human flesh hung in the cellar air like a confession written in scent. This was the moment an entire community would have to choose between comfortable lies and unbearable truth, because some revelations change everything, and there's no going back to ignorance once you've seen the evidence. The acrid smoke of kerosene and the rough texture of broken glass crunched beneath Louisa Oakley's boots as she worked frantically to gather labeled jar fragments, while above her, the voices of Timber Creek citizens grew louder and more confused. Malachi had arrived expecting a fire, and instead found Henrietta Reed crawling across the yard, babbling about murder and human meat. But when Irving Wheeler's lantern beam swept across the open cellar entrance, disbelief transformed into nauseating comprehension. "Sweet Jesus," Wheeler whispered, his weathered face going pale as moonlight. "Louisa, get out of there. Get out now." But Louisa continued her desperate collection of evidence, stuffing jar fragments into her coat pockets while calling out names she could read on the labels. Cyrus Hamilton, July 23rd. Jebediah Stewart, October 8th. "There's dozens of them, Malachi. Dozens." Cornelia Thompson pushed through the growing crowd of townspeople, her schoolteacher's rational mind struggling to process what her eyes were showing her. She'd spent weeks documenting missing travelers, but even her mathematical precision hadn't prepared her for the systematic nature of what the Langston brothers had accomplished. "Where are Percival and Lucius?" Malachi demanded, his sheriff's training finally overriding his shock. "Percival's got a knife," Henrietta gasped from her position on the ground. "Lucius went for oil to burn everything," as if summoned by her words. Lucius Thompson emerged from the roadhouse carrying a wooden bucket that sloshed with kerosene. His face bore the expression of a man who'd already calculated his chances and found them wanting. Behind him, smoke began curling from the kitchen windows. He'd already started the fire that would destroy their operation. "Too late," he called to the assembled crowd. "You're all too late." But Viola Eastwood, whose late husband's butcher training had given her an eye for meat cuts, stepped forward with grim determination. "We've been eating them, haven't we?" she said, her voice carrying the weight of terrible certainty. "All those Sunday dinners, all those church socials, we've been eating people." The crowd's murmur shifted from confusion to horror as the implications settled over them like ash from a crematorium. Families who'd praised the brothers' hospitality, who'd brought their children to feast on tender meat with rich, complex flavors that couldn't be identified. They'd all been accomplices. Some secrets taste too good to question. "The smokehouse," Cornelia said suddenly. "If they've been processing people, there'll be more evidence in the smokehouse." Irving Wheeler and two other men rushed toward the small building, but Percival Langston stepped into their path, his knife reflecting the growing firelight from the main building. "I wouldn't recommend that," he said with deadly calm. "Some doors are better left unopened." "Not anymore," Malachi replied, drawing his own weapon, a Colt revolver that trembled slightly in his grip. "It's over, Percival, all of it." But the brothers had spent months perfecting their system, and they weren't prepared to surrender it without a final, desperate gambit. Lucius hurled his bucket of kerosene toward the cellar entrance, where Louisa was still gathering evidence. The liquid splashed across the wooden frame and began trickling down the earthen stairs, filling the air with volatile fumes. "One match," Percival warned, producing a small box from his coat. "One match, and your evidence burns, along with anyone still down there." The standoff stretched taut as wire, with 20 townspeople facing two desperate men who'd built their lives around a secret too terrible to expose. But they'd made one crucial miscalculation in their planning. They'd assumed their neighbors would choose comfort over justice. They'd forgotten that some truths, once revealed, demand reckoning regardless of the cost. Cornelia Thompson had been counting the jars, cross-referencing them with her missing persons list, and her mathematical mind had reached a conclusion that chilled her blood more than the October air. "There are only 27 jars," she announced to the crowd, "but 32 people have gone missing in the last 8 months, which meant 5 victims had been processed so recently that their remains hadn't yet been preserved for the brothers' grotesque trophy collection. 5 people who might still be found in the smokehouse in various stages of preparation for Timber Creek's next community feast. The question was whether anyone had the stomach to discover exactly how fresh those remains might be. Irving Wheeler's axe bit through the smokehouse padlocks with 3 decisive blows, each impact echoing across the valley like gunshots while behind him, Percival Langston screamed threats that no longer carried any weight, because truth, once unleashed, cannot be intimidated back into silence. The heavy wooden door swung open to reveal horrors that would haunt Timber Creek for generations. What the townspeople discovered inside that smokehouse would prove that even their worst suspicions had fallen short of the brothers' true depravity. The thick, sweet stench of curing meat mingled with the metallic tang of fresh blood and the rough texture of salt-cured surfaces as Wheeler stepped into the smokehouse's interior, his lantern casting dancing shadows across hanging forms that had once been human beings. But these weren't the clean, labeled preservation jars from the cellar. These were active preparations, recent kills in various stages of processing that revealed the full scope of the brothers' systematic operation. 5 bodies hung from meat hooks, expertly butchered, according to cuts that any rancher would recognize. Shoulder, loin, tenderloin, ribs, each section carefully separated and cured with the same attention to detail that legitimate butchers applied to livestock. But the faces, what remained of them, told stories that no amount of culinary skill could erase. "That's Martha Henley," Viola Eastwood whispered, recognizing the distinctive auburn hair of a traveling seamstress who'd passed through town just 6 days earlier. She said she was heading to Spokane to visit her daughter, the daughter who would never see her mother again. Behind Wheeler, the other townspeople pressed forward despite their revulsion, compelled by the same terrible fascination that makes people stare at train wrecks. They needed to see, needed to understand exactly what they'd been consuming, needed to count the cost of their willful blindness. Cornelia Thompson pulled out her notebook and began documenting everything with the methodical precision that had first revealed the pattern of disappearances. But her hands shook as she wrote, and twice she had to stop to compose herself before continuing. Processing schedules. She read from a chart tacked to the smokehouse wall. Henley ready October 15th. Morrison ready October 17th. Church social portions prepared October 19th. The church social that half the town had been anticipating, where families would gather to share another feast of the brothers' special recipe, where children would consume meat that had once been someone's mother, someone's father, someone's beloved traveling companion. Outside the smokehouse, the confrontation between Malachi Everhart and the Langston brothers had reached its breaking point. The fire in the main building was spreading, casting flickering orange light across the scene and filling the air with choking smoke that couldn't quite mask the other smells. The sense of systematic murder that had been hidden in plain sight for months. "You can't prove anything," Percival said, but his voice lacked conviction. The evidence was overwhelming, undeniable, documented in his own careful handwriting. "We fed this town. We kept people from starving." "You fed us people," Henrietta Reed replied, having regained enough strength to stand with assistance. "You made us cannibals without our knowledge." The word hung in the air like a curse. Cannibals. Everyone who'd eaten at the roadhouse. Everyone who'd praised the brothers' hospitality. Everyone who'd brought their families to community dinners. They'd all participated in something that violated every law of God and man. Lucius made one final desperate play, striking a match and holding it near the kerosene-soaked cellar entrance. "Back away, all of you. Let us go, and maybe the evidence burns clean." But Louisa Oakley had anticipated this moment. From inside the cellar, she called out, "I already saved the important pieces. Names, dates, everything you wrote down. You can burn the building, but you can't burn the truth." The match flickered in Lucius's trembling fingers as he realized his threat held no power. The evidence would survive. The witnesses were talking, and their perfect system had collapsed into public exposure. That's when Percival Langston made his final calculation. If they couldn't destroy the evidence, and they couldn't silence the witnesses, and they couldn't escape into the wilderness with an entire town pursuing them, then only one option remained. He looked at his brother, saw the same understanding in Lucius's eyes, and nodded once. They would die on their own terms, rather than face trial for crimes that no jury could adequately punish. Both brothers raised their knives simultaneously, but instead of attacking the townspeople, they turned the blades inward in a final act of control over their own narrative. The screams that followed would echo across Timber Creek for decades, but they weren't screams of violence. They were screams of recognition, as the community understood that justice, however delayed, had finally arrived. But even as the Langston brothers bled out in the dirt beside their smokehouse of horrors, Cornelia Thompson made one final, chilling discovery. Hidden behind the hanging meat, she found a leather-bound ledger that contained not just records of their victims, but detailed plans for expanding their operation. Names of other isolated towns along the territory's trade routes. Calculations of how many travelers disappeared annually without investigation. Maps marking locations where similar enterprises might flourish undetected. The Langston brothers hadn't just been monsters, they'd been pioneers, developing a business model they'd planned to export across the American West. Today, locals in Idaho's remote valleys still whisper about roadhouses where the meat tastes too good and travelers check in but never check out. Louisa Oakley never ate meat again after climbing out of that cellar, her stomach rejecting even the sight of cooked flesh, because some memories embed themselves so deeply in the senses that they transform basic human needs into sources of revulsion. 6 months later, when she finally found the courage to testify before a territorial judge, her hands still trembled as she described the methodical precision with which the Langston brothers had turned murder into cuisine. The true horror of Timber Creek wasn't just what happened in that smokehouse, it was how easily an entire community had chosen to ignore the evidence in exchange for a good meal. The sharp crack of splitting timber, the acrid stench of burning human fat, and the rough texture of ash that coated everything for miles accompanied the destruction of the roadhouse complex on October 20th, 1895. The fire burned for 3 days, fed by decades of accumulated grease and the wooden infrastructure of systematic murder. When it finally died, nothing remained but a blackened foundation and the kind of silence that settles over places where evil has been exposed and destroyed. But burning buildings couldn't burn away memory. Henrietta Reed spent 2 weeks recovering her strength at Viola Eastwood's boarding house, during which time she provided investigators with the most complete account of the brothers' operation that any law enforcement agency had ever documented. Her testimony filled 47 pages of careful handwriting, detailing everything from the paralytic agents used to subdue victims to the specific dietary supplements designed to enhance flavor. They weren't insane, she told Judge Morrison during the territorial hearing. They were methodical, scientific. They approached murder like other men approach farming, as a business requiring efficiency and careful planning. The investigation that followed revealed the true scope of the brothers' enterprise. Territorial marshals discovered correspondence with contacts in Nevada, Montana, and Oregon, other isolated establishments where travelers disappeared at suspicious rates. The Langston brothers had been part of a larger network, a loosely connected confederation of predators who shared techniques and occasionally traded victims. 32 confirmed deaths were attributed to the Timber Creek operation alone, but the psychological aftermath proved more difficult to quantify than the body count. Cornelia Thompson abandoned her teaching position and moved to San Francisco, claiming she could no longer look at her former neighbors without wondering how many Sunday dinners they'd shared in knowing complicity. Her mathematical mind, once devoted to education, became obsessed with calculating probabilities, how many other communities might harbor similar secrets, how many missing persons reports disguised systematic murder. The town itself began dying almost immediately. Families packed their belongings and left for communities where the local specialties didn't carry the taste of human suffering. The general store closed by Christmas. The church held its final service on New Year's Day, 1896, with only 7 congregants present to hear Reverend Collins deliver a sermon about collective guilt and communal redemption. By spring, Timber Creek had become a ghost town. But the story didn't end with abandonment. In 1923, a geological survey team investigating mineral deposits in the area reported finding human bones scattered throughout the valley, far more remains than could be accounted for by the known victims. Their preliminary count suggested the brothers' operation had claimed closer to 60 lives, with some remains dating back nearly a decade before their exposure. The survey was quietly discontinued, and the area was designated as unsuitable for development due to soil contamination. Irving Wheeler, the last resident to leave Timber Creek, lived until 1941 and spent his final years writing detailed accounts of what he'd witnessed. His manuscript, discovered after his death, contained this haunting observation. We made ourselves accomplices through appetite. Every time we praised the flavor, every time we asked for seconds, every time we chose not to ask questions, we participated in our own corruption. But perhaps the most disturbing legacy of the Langston brothers wasn't the murders themselves, but the ease with which they'd convinced an entire community to become unwitting cannibals. Their technique had been so refined, their presentation so appealing, that people had actively sought out meals containing human flesh without ever suspecting the source. They'd proven that civilization was far thinner than anyone wanted to believe. Modern criminologists who've studied the case note that the brothers' methodology shared characteristics with operations discovered decades later in other remote locations. The careful documentation, the systematic approach to victim selection, the transformation of murder into a form of artisanal craft. These patterns continue to emerge in cases where isolation provides cover for humanity's darkest impulses. Some investigators theorize that the techniques pioneered in Timber Creek influenced serial killers well into the 20th century, creating a legacy of methodical murder that persisted long after the original practitioners had died. The abandoned ruins of the roadhouse were finally cleared in 1967 during highway construction, but workers reported finding additional bone fragments buried throughout the property. The excavation uncovered evidence of a much larger operation than anyone had imagined. Multiple cellars, sophisticated preservation equipment, and documentation suggesting the brothers had been planning to franchise their methods across the territorial frontier. They'd envisioned a network of roadhouses serving the same specialty to unsuspecting travelers from coast to coast. Today, criminologists still study the Timber Creek case as an example of how ordinary people can become complicit in extraordinary evil through willful ignorance and the simple desire for comfort. The brothers' careful records, preserved despite the fire, provide insight into the psychology of systematic murder that continues to inform modern investigations. But for the survivors, the most lasting trauma wasn't the knowledge of what they'd consumed, it was the memory of how much they'd enjoyed it, how they'd praised the tenderness, savored the complex flavors, and eagerly anticipated each new meal. Some tastes, once acquired, never truly fade. We're only scratching the surface. The next case is even darker. Subscribe before it drops.